Thank you very much for inviting me to the meeting. Sorry I'm not there in person, but hopefully next time I will be. I'd like to talk today about why some diagnostic technologies succeed while others fail. And this is based on 28 case studies that we conducted. I'll give you the background on that in a few moments. I'm going to talk about a few things today. One is the background on Halteres Associates, who are we? And then spend most of the time talking about success factors for diagnostic companies, going through those case studies, and then examples of best practices that people follow to help them be successful. So briefly on Halteres, we've been around since, well, it's been 20 years now, 2002. Just 4 employees at the group, but we're about 150 independent consultants that we call associates. And it's a virtual organization. We bring them in to work with us on teams when we need them. Last 5 years, we've conducted over 125 projects with 45 different of our associates. We do mostly diagnostics, some devices, some therapeutics, but our favorite is diagnostics. To date, we work with 3 different kinds of clients. One are startup companies, over 200 companies from all over the world to date. Many multinational companies in diagnostics directly, or companies that are interested in it. For instance, Intel and a few pharmaceutical companies, and then not-for-profit organizations in global health. Our first client was the Gates Foundation. We've done many projects with them over the years, but WHO, UnitAid, Foundation for Innovative New Diagnostics. And given the way the work we're organized, it's possible for us to do almost anything companies want to be done. Everything from research, product development, manufacturing, regulatory, many other things as well. And we consider ourselves to be connectors and mavens, as Malcolm Gladwell put it in his very interesting book, The Tipping Point. That's it on Halteres. So now let's briefly get into this success factors for diagnostic companies and their case studies. So a little bit of background before I go into details here. This came out of the fact that several years ago, we were doing some work with the Gates Foundation with a few companies, one of which promptly went out of business. And they just didn't understand why. They thought this company was on the road to success, but it didn't pan out. And they asked us, well, why did that happen? In fact, why do some succeed and some not succeed? And we discussed it amongst ourselves. We came up with this notion of doing a study like this. So what we did was we actually evaluated 28 different companies, and some others not shown. The companies were assessed and scored based on how well they did or were doing. The results were organized by product development growth phase. I'm going to go through those. That's something that we came up with the Gates Foundation together on back in 2014. And we defined 3 types of companies. 2 of them are obvious, one maybe not be. Successes. Successes were based on those companies having reached the market with their product and maintaining sustainability, and it was actually sales for at least 3 years. But in fact, I'll tell you now, most of them went way beyond that. I'm going to jump to the bottom. Then we talked about failures. We wanted to look at failures, companies that went out of business or were sold off for very little money. And then a third group, which we called zombies, which actually was very interesting. We identified these based on their continuing struggle to become sustainable. And in our collective opinion, we thought they were ultimately not going to make it. And I'll tell you a bit of what's happened with them. So for the failures and the zombies, we identified specific events that we felt were the main triggering problem. We identified other things as well, but in most cases, you could say, that's what really did it. We reviewed and modified our assessment with input from industry experts, people that we knew in the companies or from other companies or investors, a number of different types of individuals. And in all the cases, in fact, this is why we selected these companies, we had very good inside knowledge of what was going on. And just by the very nature of what we did, particularly with the zombies, we're not at liberty to show the companies by name. So let me just briefly go into these phases of growth, 0 through 4. 0 is the design or concept phase. This is where you develop what the intended use of the technology is. I'm going to go into this a bit more here, but it's what are you really going to do with it? What decisions are going to be made as a result of this test? Looking at things like the market size, competition, intellectual property, and what sort of average selling price you think you can establish for this? And Paul just gave that wonderful talk. In some markets, you need to have a very low cost to be competitive at all, and others it can be higher. But you need to be very clear on what you're going to do and what will be acceptable. And then something I'll come back to later, these target product profiles. Many of you may be very familiar with that, but also it would be in some companies what would be referred to as the market requirements document. And it's typically technology agnostic, because here you're defining what you really need this product to do, not necessarily how you're going to do it. But oftentimes in this early phase, people have been working on some technology, perhaps in an academic laboratory, but this is not the first item for a company. And you're trying to reduce some risks about the potential performance of this test, even before you go into the formal next phase, feasibility and planning. So here in this phase, the product requirements that satisfy the unmet need are developed. It's usually with people who are commercially savvy and the technical people together working that through. Find and build a team with appropriate leadership positions, usually slowly but surely. Much effort is dedicated to creating and tuning the technology at this phase, because now you're trying to get to what I'm going to refer to here as a prototype. So this is not going through formal product development yet. It is a so-called prototype that has performance and has characteristics kind of like what you envisioned in phase 0, but it's not quite there yet, because you're going to do something more substantial in the next phase, which is phase 2, design and development. And here you're going through formal product development is conducted under formal design control to meet the target product profile. So here, the appropriate documentation, quality systems are in place, and you're doing it in such a way that you believe you've got all the inventions out of it already. You've finished that. Now you are just taking it through the formal processes, verification, validation to get it ready to commercialize. This is a place where you are also trying to develop the manufacturability. This is an issue that you'll see coming up here, but designing a product for manufacturability is a very, very important thing to do. And some companies do this way too late, if at all. So the major risks of the product design have been addressed and minimized here. And at the end of this phase, the product is ready for commercial manufacturing. Now we're in phase 3, validation and launch readiness. Manufacturing process is finalized. You've gone through whatever you need to for initial introduction, but also you've thought through scale up and what that's going to require. Clinical trials, clinical studies are being developed if this is a diagnostic product for that type of market to support regulatory and then payment or reimbursement, depending on what kind of market you're in. You don't get paid for it. You're not going to continue to be able to do this. And acceptance in the medical community, which is extraordinarily important. So the marketing strategy and detailing of the customer targets, that's all been determined here. You're ready to go for the next phase, number 4, commercialization. And this is where operations are stabilized. You either manufacture yourself or you have somebody helping you manufacture it. You know what you're going to do, what the process is to get the product on the market, to get paid for it, to get the appropriate people lined up behind you. You find partners where and if you need them, and you ensure that you've got sufficient capital to support operations as you move to sustain and sell the business, depending on what your goals are. So I've got some of the key components of each of those phases lined up here in these boxes, and also lined up with the phases. And I'm showing you this because I'm going to now take you to this slide. Please don't be afraid. This is, I know, a very complicated slide, but I'm going to take a fair amount of time going through this because this is where most of the major lessons were learned in our case studies. Let me explain how this is organized. So firstly, over here, we picked 6 success stories. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. We picked 8 companies that we thought were zombies, and we picked 14 failures. And I think it was very important for us to have sufficient failures so that we know what issues led to failures, and they're rather varied, actually. Now I've got these phases 0 through 4 lined up here, and then those various components of what's being done in those phases. And then we've got different types of dots here. So we've got the green ones, and those are indication that within that category, let's say phase 0, this particular company did it very well. They were successful with it. They were successful all the way across. And then we've got the yellow, which is moderate. We felt, the people we interviewed felt they could have done a better job, but it was good enough. And then we've got the black ones where we felt, and our interviewees felt they had failed at those particular tasks. Now, I mentioned earlier that we wanted to also look at what we thought were the triggering events in each of these. So in the case of the failures, that means they have a gray box here. In the case of the zombies, the ones we thought would be a problem for them longer term, we've got a sort of pinkish color here. And lastly, we've got these triangles. The triangles are where the company went along and they failed by the time they got to the end of this. So from that point forward, the triangles indicate they didn't participate in those continued parts of the growth process. Okay, so let's look at these at the failures first. The failures here tended to fail early on in the process. They tended to not clearly define the intended use. We see this fairly often where people assume people need to make a particular decision with a test and it's not quite what they need, so that's problematic. Or they clearly define that, but then in those early studies, they find they just can't make the performance requirements. And sometimes that can take a long time for a company to recognize, but it happens often, and it is the #1 cause of failure that we found in these particular studies. Some of them went a little further. They didn't have the right leadership. That is a fairly common issue. You can see that's true of a number of these companies. We didn't think that was the failing point in many of them, but it was a key issue in a lot of them. Some of them made it a lot further. This particular company had difficulties with supply chain, and as so many of us are nowadays. And it wasn't. The key thing here was it wasn't designed for manufacturability. Big issue. And these two companies, the clinical studies supporting the intended use just didn't pan out. A lot of those companies like to say the biology just didn't work for us. And here's one where it got all the way out to the point where they simply could not get the level of reimbursement that they needed to sustain the company, and they went out of business. Okay, successes, pretty easy to look at. They did a pretty darn good job across the board. There were a few places where we thought that it wasn't as good as it could have been, but they weren't things that caused the company to fail. In some cases, they may have taken a little longer to get where they needed to go, but they ultimately had those at least 3 years of sustainable sales, and I think almost all of them were substantially more than that. Now the zombies. Zombies are interesting here. You do see some early failures in 3 of these in the same place we saw the failures here, but we felt that these 3 companies had made a critical error here in the intended use or the design. And the others, like this one here, where the payment down the road tended to be the thing that was the most difficult, in our opinion, at the time. Remember, we did this back in 2014, we finished in 2015. Now I'm going to be able to tell you a little bit about where that all went to. So next slide here then. We worked with a group headed by John Peabody called CURE. It does a lot of interesting work in clinical design. And we did a few more studies with the data that we had, looking at, for instance, the success of a company. We had shown this qualitative just now, just colors, but then we converted those colors to numbers. And we had a range of scores as a result of that, 26 being the most you could get. So the failures tended to have a range of 0 to 16, zombies 3 to 23, and successes way up there. And this was significantly different from one another. And we also looked at the fact that the majority of the failures occur in phase 0 and 1, as I showed you before. So what does the score look like in phase 0 to 1 for all these different types of companies? And so it ends up that only one organization got up to 12 here, but most of them had a piling up of the troubles early on, totally in contrast to the successes. And then you see the zombies kind of moved across the scene here. So remember that the successes and failures were retrospectively determined. That is, we knew their outcome. They were successful, they failed. We didn't know that about the zombies. So between when we finished the project, 2015, and 2021, it ends up that 7 of the zombies are out of business. They're not in diagnostics any longer at all. 5 of them shuttered the doors and closed down. 2 of them found something else that they decided to do with their technical capability, and they're still around. And 1 of them is still around, and excuse me, it may actually be a success long term. So we're not perfect. Didn't say we were, but looks like we did a pretty good job determining that the companies with the characteristics that we found may have some difficulty making it longer term. So we wanted to see what kind of issues in more detail could we point to that were generally issues with these companies. And we did this assessment, like I said, with people that we had interviewed who had participated in some of these companies or were very closely aligned with them. So firstly, does the team have a thorough understanding of the customers, stakeholders, and unmet needs? I've talked about that already, but that really stands out here. If so, how do they know someone will buy it and at what price? And what alternatives exist? Really, the bottom line on that is, what's the competition look like now? And what do you know about what's being done in the background that may come out in a time frame when you're going to bring yours out? And is that going to be, will you still be competitive? And I like this. Someone taught me this many years ago. In a startup, there's no time for anybody to learn a new job. I mean, you really have to walk in and be able to do what needs to be done, and hopefully you find people with experience that can do that. Sometimes you can't because it's a new technology, it's a new type of skill set, but typically you can find people that can do most of this, and you want to do that. And don't be fooled by hiring people that worked in tool area or pharma or some other kind of biotech. I've made the mistake twice of hiring salespeople from pharma to sell diagnostics. I don't know why I didn't learn the first time, but I didn't. And the second time, I was sure I was right. So that's I didn't want to do that. I don't want to do that again. Does the team have plans to implement the design control, and do they have direct experience in developing products under the system? Very important. Need people who know how to do that. But I must say, on the other side of the coin here, sometimes people actually implement this too early, and they create themselves a very big headache in the documentation they have to go through. You want to make sure that you are ready for product development when you implement this. But when you are, you better be ready to do it well. Does the team have the experience and intentions to partner with others for skill sets and competencies that are needed? This is something that often people do either too early or too late. In some cases, you may need certain skill set like reimbursement or regulatory that you can't justify a full-time position for. That's all right, that makes sense, but then you should be looking for consultants that can help you with that, at least temporarily. And I mentioned this before, this issue of processes to design for manufacturing. Very, very important. That's right up front. Most people who do this well have a manufacturing expert, at least as a consultant, right there early, looking at them with their choices about what materials to use, how they're going to make this with injection molding, whatever, because we've seen a number of times when people didn't take that in consideration early on. They thought they had a prototype that was going to work. They brought in a manufacturing person. They said, that's really nice, but of course it's not manufacturable. That's a problem. Do we have realistic timelines and understanding of the cost that is going to be required to get all the way through your commercial launch? Do you understand the full ecosystem of where you're going to introduce this? What I mean is, sometimes you bring new technologies into a place where we expect people to do testing, well, you didn't consider the other things which are problematic at the same time, the other pain points. For instance, very simply, if you take a test into a low to middle income country and you go to something like a microscopy center, you expect them to be able to use large instrumentation, not going to happen. They just don't have the right skill sets there. There may be other issues you have to deal with as well. So understanding the rest of the pain points, not just the testing, is very important. And this is an important issue for particularly investors, you might imagine. What is the return on investment for each of the investors all the way through your plan? Is that sufficient to attract the required investment and commercialize the product? Really important to think about that all the way through to the point at which you're either going to, let's say, become fully integrated and support yourself, do an IPO, sell it to another company. What does that path look like? So I've rearranged some of these issues I just was talking about into the specific phases. I'm not going to go through this now. Of course, we'll make the slides available to whoever wants them, and you can go through that later. But I want to start talking a bit now about, oops, I'm sorry, I missed one thing here. So I mentioned that we interviewed a number of people about this, and these were the things in the order of the people who were investors. These are the things that were most concerning to them when they see companies and their understanding of them. So I've mentioned, I think, most of these before. First is the importance of success factors. Oops, apologize. That you have an experienced leadership team. They really focused on that. Are these the right people to run this company? Quality systems must be in place early, but not too early. Companies must have the ability and desire to partner with others with the requisite expertise, and there must be a realistic understanding of what it's going to take. And just so you know, if you aren't familiar with this, it's not uncommon for it to take 5 to 7 years for successful new biomarkers, new markets, new platforms, and 3 to 5 years for successful test menu additions, even to existing platforms. It just you got to be realistic about it. And I talked about the understanding of the customer and the environment, manufacturing, and the attractive return on investment for the parties involved. Okay, now a few things about best practices. So we like to put together use cases. I mean, you're probably accustomed to this sort of thing. The use cases typically would contain information about the intended use. It would have information about who the intended customer is. It would have information about who will be tested, the population you're going to test, and then other attributes that are particularly important, like sensitivity, specificity, turnaround time, whatever else you might need to know that comes out of that analysis. This is a study we did several years ago during the Ebola epidemic in West Africa for Grand Challenges Canada. And I just want to point out a couple of things here. First, this is one of 10 use cases that we looked at for Ebola. The first one being field case detection in current epidemic setting. So there's a place where you know the epidemic is present, you know that a lot of people are going to be infected. Even in this circumstance, in many cases, not everybody with these symptoms is going to be infected with Ebola, but it's much higher than it would be otherwise. And here, of course, you want to make sure that people are wearing the appropriate protective gear. And some companies that were developing tests in this environment didn't think about the fact that they've got to be able to use the test wearing those gloves and masks and everything else. So you better make sure you've taken that into consideration. And that in terms of performance, something like clinical specificity isn't quite as big an issue with them in this environment, because you're going to have a substantial number of people who you expect to be positive. You'll have processes in place to deal with people who are positive. False positive, you'd like to keep them low, but you could accept a few and get away with it. That's in contrast to where you're going to be doing Ebola testing or screening in areas of previous outbreaks. Now, there's no current outbreak here, and so people will not be wearing unusual protective gear as it would be in an epidemic itself. And so the test can be used in that environment. But now the specificity is going to be a big issue, because if you start finding false positive individuals, it's going to make people worry that you have a new outbreak and they're going to have to respond to that. So it becomes a much bigger issue. Now, what happened in the epidemic was that a number of people had designed products for the first use case, And after the epidemic was over, those did not consider this next one, and it wasn't appropriate in this particular population, they had to take the products off the market. So understanding what the multiple use cases are that you want to inform with your test is extremely important. And just taking it one more further is differential diagnosis. So we're seeing a lot of this sort of thing right now in case of SARS-CoV-2, where you don't want to just look at that one organism, Ebola, you want to look at additional ones. And here be Lassa or Marburg or even flu that can have similar symptoms. But if this is in a differential diagnostic environment where there are multiplex tests, now you have to have very good performance of each test within that multiplex format. You'll be doing studies on each of them individually, but in one product. So cross-reactivity with the other organisms you're looking at is a big problem. Something we like to use, and I think a lot of people who are good at developing products use this approach, storyboards. So this is one we did for the Gates Foundation on somehow I keep skipping slides. There it is, not sure why. There's the first. So this was where we're looking at the point of care TB test. And the idea was that you wanted community healthcare workers to go to somebody's home and be able to test them with this test. And we're thinking in terms of, well, you got multiple ways they can get to that house. They might drive in a van, they might drive in a motorcycle, they might carry in a pack. Now, in terms of this issue of how to design the product, if you design the product just for carrying in a vehicle, you're not going to be worrying too much about the size of it. But if you're carrying in a pack, you're very worried about the size and the weight of it. And if you design it for this use case, you can do all three. If you design it for this one, that's the only one you're going to be able to do. So those are the kind of things you want to be able to take into consideration. Another point here is, look here, disposal of the materials after they've tested this person in their home. Are you really going to try to incinerate it in front of their house, or are you going to have to consider you're going to bring all that material back with you? How are you going to do that? How is that going to be safe to do? How will you carry it? And same kind of things when we're looking at, for instance, the test being done in the facility by someone who may have the skill set of a community healthcare worker, but now you're going to be able to test it in, let's say, a site where you can put that product on top of a table or somewhere else. So that could be a heavier product, could be something larger than the one that you carry in a backpack going to the person's home. But that means if you design it for this environment, you won't be doing the home testing. So that's the sort of thing you want to take into consideration. You're probably familiar with this notion of target product profile. This is something that's come out of the global health community and previously from the pharma community, and now being used quite commonly for diagnostic tests. If you want to see some really nice target product profiles for low to middle income country products, you might look at the Find website. They've got a lot of good things there. Now, this is where we're looking at the general attributes of the product requirements. You know, what does it need to do? And it's typically given in two forms: minimal and optimal. When we're talking about optimal, that means that if all the minimum requirements are met, a product will be acceptable for the application. That's a really important point. Optimal means that if those optimal criteria are met beyond the minimum, it will approve the product. But you don't have to get those done. That's what you've agreed to within your company, and hopefully the people you've talked to, that these optimal conditions will be things that will improve the test, but minimal is acceptable. And this is usually technology independent. You're trying to find out what does it need to do, not how it's going to be done. That next step comes later in phase, excuse me, phase one with the product specification determination. And this is part of a target product profile we did for Gates several years ago. I'd love to show you other ones, but they're under confidentiality, so I can't, but these we can. And this is one of 4 pages for this. Just show you some of the things that are here in terms of minimal requirements, optimal requirements, Now, for instance, the number of operator steps, lots of discussions about that, semi-quantitative versus qualitative. We'd like to have this, we've got to have at least this. Performance down here, the clinical sensitivity, 80% was acceptable, but they'd love to have more. You know what almost always happens in these circumstances? Development teams start working on it and they say, you can have 95%, but that's going to take another year. Will you still go with the acceptable? Yes, we'll go with the acceptable. You can improve it later. But those are the kinds of discussions that this sets up. So being able to do a good target profile is very important. And then there is one other, and this is my last best practice, which I think is a very important one, is risk and mitigation planning. Now, it's fairly typical for people to do this. In fact, you probably have seen this in grant applications, and people want you to be able to indicate how you're going to address this. And it could be something like the management team has sufficient diagnostic experience, which I know I talked about, is the development and regulatory timelines realistic, and you will, as a team, be assessing the level of that. But the most important thing is not just this one-time event. It is using this process as ongoing analysis, being realistic about it. So here was the starting point. Let's pretend it was way back in 2018. Now, as you moved along here, you were able to deal with this problem, fund a management team that you're happy with. Other things that were medium, they became lower. You've dealt with that. But it's not uncommon for people to find, oops, it's actually harder than we thought. It's now higher. You refocus your effort in your organization to make sure you deal with these high risk items first, and then take it down to the point where it's solved. Same thing here. So I know that was a lot in a short period of time. Hopefully you found this helpful, and thanks for listening, and I'll be happy to entertain any questions that might be of interest to you. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mickey. Ladies and gentlemen, are there any questions for Dr. Mickey Urdea? Yes, Dan.
Is there a correlation between getting SBIR funding?
Yeah. The question that Dan had was, is there any correlation between getting an SBIR grant for one of these small companies and success going forward? Have you seen that in your analyses of companies?
Yes. So I've seen both sides of that. I've seen death by SBIR, and I've seen success by it. You know, I've seen many companies that they get an SBIR grant. It isn't in their focus area, but they get it because they can. They divert some of their resources toward it, and it doesn't lead to products. It leads to some interesting publications, but that's not what you really want. But people that have recognized that what they can get their SBIR for is right on the path for what they want to get into the marketplace. Yeah, that's a very successful way to go. Sometimes there's that gap between the first phase and the next phase you've got to deal with, but that's getting better over time, and it's that. And you know, now with the NIH RADx grants that so many people have used for the SARS-CoV-2, and now they're all poised to determine what else they're going to do with their test platforms because they got that. Grants are a good way to go. Nice non-dilutive funding.
Thank you, Mickey. Any further questions, ladies and gentlemen? If not, let's thank Dr. Urdea once again for a very nice talk.
Thanks. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.